welcome back to ThreatTraq Essentials. We're back. We were on a brief hiatus for a few weeks, but I'm here today with Manny Ortiz. How you doing, Manny?
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, first, let's talk about the story you brought to us about cubot, which is really interesting. It's up to some really tricky stuff. Tell me what it is and what it's doing.
Yeah, so cubot is it's basically a bot or malware that has been around for quite some time now, and it's using a lot of different techniques. And over the years, it's morphed. It's a pretty sophisticated piece of malware, and over the years, it has definitely sort of gotten more and more sophisticated in its techniques. In this particular case, we're dealing with something that uses a slightly newer technique where it's trying to fool the user into thinking that it has something to do with Windows Defender by using these stylized sheets.
Really, it really fools the user into thinking it's getting a message from its antivirus software, but instead it's really tricking them.
Correct. Yeah, and that's really the crux of this, right? It's using something that the user will typically see pop up on their screen, when they've got to respond to something. And in this case, Windows Defender, something that we may see from time to time popping up, so we'll be familiar with the way that they look. And so it's using sort of language, and it's using graphics on the screen, so that it looks like it may be coming from the Windows operating system as opposed to the malicious bad actor who actually created it. And it's using that technique to fool the end user into actually clicking something, right?
So how do you protect yourself from being fooled by it?
In this case, I think what we've talked about for forever now, which is just always be careful with anything that gets delivered to you via email, right? So if it's an attachment, you should be wary of opening anything that is an attachment. If you somehow do get fooled into opening something up like an Excel spreadsheet, you should also be doubly wary if the spreadsheet is asking to enable macros.
Let's talk about one of the stories that Mike Stair brought to us about a vulnerability in Azure, which is with a cloud service, basically. So tell me what's going on there and what the vulnerability was.
So in this particular case, it was against the Azure App Services. In this case, it's as you said, the Microsoft cloud-based Azure App Services gave you access that you shouldn't have had within the cloud space.
So let's suppose whether or not you're using Azure, is there some general lessons we can take from the story? I know Mike mentioned there was even some issues with the passwords that they were using and about using services on the internet that perhaps you don't fully understand yet.
The lesson here is obviously, as more and more things are moving into the cloud, the thing here is that cloud, in essence, is no different than, sort of the things that we always, as security professionals, have to keep in mind when we're building something, when we're building it in-house as opposed to out in the cloud. The difference is just, sort of where it's sitting. But in terms of how you build something, you really should have that sort of same security mindset when you're building it. So all the things that go into like, hey, I'm building an application, but I have it in-house, that go into that, things like strong authentication, strong passwords, where the passwords are actually stored, instead of storing them within the code or within the repositories, and then using strong passwords, right? As we saw in this particular story, the password that was being used for SSH wasn't exactly a strong password, and unfortunately, where it was being stored was also something that shouldn't have been overlooked.
You brought us a second story about phishers creating their own web pages. Now, we've seen a lot of that before, but tell me how it was done differently.
Yeah, so in this case, the real big difference here is sort of how in this particular phishing campaign or campaigns, how it was actually being delivered. So we are very accustomed to sort of being very mindful of double and sometimes triple checking that link that I just got in this email that seems to come from my bank is in fact going to my bank before I actually submit my credentials. And so in this case, we are now talking about an attachment, which, again, the mindset changes a little bit when it's an attachment versus a link. And, again, we still have sort of that mental note, I think a lot of us do, it's an attachment, so there could still be some danger here. But unfortunately, the way that browsers handle attachments today, the twist here is that the attachment itself opens up like a local file, and it opens up in the browser, and folks, I think, just don't realize that browser, that it opens up this local file that's presenting this page. You think that this is all local and that it wouldn't be going anywhere if I enter my credentials here, but in fact, the page is in fact acting like a page. It's just being hosted locally on your machine as opposed to on some server right out on the internet. And that's the only difference here, right? So if I put my credentials in, even though the page is actually being hosted locally, those credentials are actually being sent out, regardless of whether the file is here locally or being hosted somewhere out on the internet.
So how do you protect yourself then? How do you keep from being fooled if you can't roll over it with your cursor to check where it goes?
This one's a little bit harder to defend against. I mean, I think realistically, this goes back to the whole notion of just really paying attention to whether it's a link inside of an email or whether it's an attachment in an email. I think you still have to have that same mentality and sort of question whether or not it's something that comes from a legitimate source, right? So yes, it's hard to be able to, once the page gets brought up, you can't see where my credentials are actually going because I can't hover over the submit button. There are a couple of techniques that you can use. They're a little bit more advanced, and I'm not sure if everybody's going to be willing to go into the developer tools for a browser. But I think just being mindful that, hey, where did this email come from? Where is that link taking me to? What kind of attachment is that, right? Should I really be opening it? Or it's still the same questions that I think you should be asking yourself.
And finally, Mike brought us a second story about HashiCorp Vault and vulnerabilities that were found there by a researcher. What can we learn from this, even if that's not a service that you're using? What lessons can we draw from this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big lesson here is that this is, again, something that is being hosted up in the cloud. It is basically a third-party application that's being hosted up in the cloud. And we need to look at these things the same way that we would look at anything that's being locally hosted on your own network, right? They're prone to the same types of vulnerabilities because of mistakes that were made originally when they were coding, and unfortunately in this case, these vulnerabilities, the repair vulnerabilities, led to authentication bypass, which unfortunately it's some of the more severe stuff that you don't want to see out there. So,
okay, well, thank you very much, Manny, for that great advice. And if you want to keep up with this great security advice every week, please like or subscribe below. We'll see you next time.